Good afternoon. We're going to try to get started right away because we have a very full program, but we also have faculty and students who have to leave promptly at the end. So we'll get started. Expect some people to walk in late, and that's fine, but I'll go get started. So this is an event that comes out of an exhibition at the Canadian Centre for Architecture on the architectural pedagogy of the Open University, which began in the 1970s. And then the director, Mirko Zardini, put together a series of programs that's kind of followed up to take the exhibition as a kind of grounding point and then go to various schools. You've been to various schools to look at how the legacy of Open University, either intentionally or, let's say, genealogically, can be connected in some ways to current education and also, and that's our title, the future of education. We have two very special guest visitors. Mirko, and I'm going to be very brief in my introductions. I'm going to introduce everyone so that we can get on with the program. Mirko Zardini is the director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture. He's been there since 2005, trained as an architect. Mirko is a very long-standing friend of the GSD. He was on our visiting committee. He's actually made some very important, from the visiting committee, made some very important suggestions, demands, may I say, for
whenever we go wrong, it's my fault.
So, and some things went right. That's to his credit. The other special guest is a person who actually began or was among the founders of Open University, Tim Benton, and we'll hear from him soon. Tim has taught at many places, including in the States, Columbia, and the Clark Institute at Williams College. But as I said, the Course A305, he was one of the founders and main lecturers. We have two other special people from inside. Lisa Haber-Thomson is design critic in architecture this year with our core program. She's actually a PhD student just about to graduate and is exploring relationships between law, architecture, the idea of territory, and I would say biopolitics. And so we look, what am I saying? One of the main reasons she's here is that she and I did together the Harvard X course, The Architectural Imagination. So she's very involved with issues of pedagogy. She's also with Megan Panzano, one of the coordinators of our undergraduate program in architecture studies. So, and then John May, a founding partner along with Zaina Kuratim of the Architecture Office Millions, and also director of our Master of Design Studies. So again, also interested in pedagogy, but in particular, John's idea of the post-orthographic intelligence. That is, now as we're moving forward into digital, post-perspectival, post-orthographic design education in particular, and we'll try to hook some of these ideas back to the Open University legacy. Mirko, you will start off.
So thank you, Michael, and thank you to GSD for having taken this provocation that we made to some universities. We did this program, research project, program, exhibitions, books on the Open University for three main reasons. One is to analyze what is the role of education and university today, if you compare with that example. The second is which is the role of the tools in shaping education. And the third is can we make a comparison of a history, architectural course, 1970s, and a theory and history, you already noticed the difference, of today. Each university, we did that, Montreal, Toronto, here, Michigan, we'll do something with Columbia too. Each university has given a different interpretation to this kind of provocation, so that is that reason we are here today. But I just want to go a little bit deeper on one point Why do we do that? So I wanted to read you some title of newspapers about university education that came out US and Europe in the last years. New York Times. Graduate education is the Detroit of higher learning. Italian Il Post, il fallimento di university, the failure of university. Le Monde, la réforme de l'université, en catastrophe. And the Telegraph, Britain's university must change to survive. So I feel that behind this open university and behind these massive open online courses, there is a bigger question that I think that we have to address. And just to mention a very important contribution that Marilyn Robinson made on the New York Review of Books, she was really addressing the issues of the mandate of the universities, questioning what she called the Fabian model, so the idea that universities are today here to produce skilled laborers for precarious, ever-expanding knowledge economy, and questioning that in name of a university that was able to produce a much more critical understanding of the reality we are part of. So the Open University, with its political and social mandate, is a clear example that we can confront with if we look at what is the situation of the contemporary education, not only in North America, but more and more all over the world. And I just want to remind you that 43% of the students were women, that 15% were housewives, 3% tradesmen, 2% farming, mining, or manufacturing laborers, 11% clerical and office, 4% were salesmen, and 2% retirees and unemployed person. And Open University was also followed by students in the British prisons at that time, with tutors following them also in that condition. So it's I just give you these figures to remind you of a political and social mandate that was behind this social democratic project that came out in England in the 70s. And I think that the best way to continue about that is to leave the word to Tim Benton to go deeper in the Open University discussion.
Thank you, Mika. Thank you, Michael, for this invitation to come here and talk about the Open University. It makes me feel a bit guilty hearing Mika and Michael as well, because I'm not talking about the present. This is the voice of the past. This was a course that was made when most of you weren't born. So, and the Open University is no longer like it was then. That's me at the age of 27 filming the Villa Savoie. To follow up on these, now how do I advance? Right, to follow up on these brief remarks, I've been given 20 minutes, so I'm going to try to stick to that, and that's why I'm going to read. I hate reading, but otherwise, if I start anecdoting, we'll be here all day. I urge you to read Joachim's book, which is what we saw on the image before, or any of the histories of the Open University, like that one that I can show you there. A305, History of Architecture and Design, 1890 to 1939, was an Open University third-level undergraduate course. Unlike most undergraduate teaching that takes place behind closed doors, Open University courses sometimes had a public life that escaped their original intentions and ambitions. It was discussed in the British and European media. Yes, French and German there. By a strange twist of fate, the course was also exhibited at the Venice Biennale in 1976 in the Ca' Foscari, and by an even stranger twist of fate, appeared as one of a series of token representations in a more recent Biennale as part of Beatrice Colomina's Radical Pedagogies exhibit in 2014. Not particularly radical in its content, the course was part of the radical, not to say revolutionary, especially at the time, educational adventure that was and is the Open University in Great Britain. So in this brief intervention, I will try to explain first the Open University, then A305, and finally, for what they're worth, my views of the value of the moving image in teaching architectural history, the theme of today's discussion. The Open University emerged from a particular moment in British Labour politics in 1969, when the traditional left merged with a managerial political elite convinced that the modern technologies available to capitalism could deliver benefits to the working classes. Jenny Lee, on the right, widow of the Labour firebrand Nye Bevan, was the stimulus, and Prime Minister Harold Wilson, next to her, the enabler. The Open University is a university like any other in Britain. That is to say, we have a royal charter giving us independent authority to award degrees at undergraduate and postgraduate level. We are open to people, places, methods, and ideas. There are no entrance examinations. Students register themselves. Although it suited both the government and popular journalism to describe the OU as the University of the Air, it has always been primarily a correspondence university, teaching with texts that we write and either print ourselves or co-publish. For example, almost all the art history courses since the 1990s have been co-published by Yale University Press, and you can buy the books in a bookshop or consult them in the library. This is some of the This is some of the OU's current good news propaganda. The OU began with 5 faculties: science, technology, education, arts, and social sciences. Our courses are arranged in levels, first, second, and third, corresponding to levels of difficulty equivalent to the 3 years of a conventional degree. Originally, 1 foundation course per faculty, 2 interdisciplinary cultural studies, early modern and enlightenment, followed by third-level specialist courses, of which A305 was the first in the Department of Art History. But students who have widely different backgrounds are generally free to choose which courses they take and in which order. The OU covers England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, which is actually a problem nowadays because these are considered nation dependencies. We also have around 7,000 students in Europe and around the world. And in 2010, when I retired, the university as a whole had 250,000 students. We're by far the biggest university in Britain. Up until 2010, students paid around £800 to take a credit. A credit is a year's work part-time, so you can consider it a semester of full-time teaching. You needed 6 of these for a degree, but you could get credit exemption if you had post-school academic qualifications from a nursing certificate to a full degree. And 40% of our students by the 2000 or so were studying who already had a full degree, or coming back to lifelong learning. Every student was, every student was a member of a student group of up to 25 who knew their tutors, who had tutors and knew them on first-name terms. If they lived in a town, they would meet their tutor more or less regularly for seminars or day schools. But the essential teaching contact was through assessment. Students wrote, and still write, monthly TMAs, tutor-marked assignments, which the tutors grade and comment on. There's also a 3-hour examination at the end of some courses held in traditional invigilated conditions. Successive Labour and Conservative governments have undermined higher education in general, preferring to pay off the national debt rather than invest in its people. And this has hit the OU hard because ours is a capital-intensive business. Since I retired, the university has had to raise its fees from around £800 to nearly £3,000. And if you think of a domestic budget, £800 is something you can save for, £3,000 is the family holiday or preparing to buy the next car. As a result, the student numbers have plummeted, have gone down by 1/3 since then. This has hit the OU hard because ours is a capital-intensive business, I've said. We had a contract with the BBC, which paid them to produce a certain number of TV and radio programs per year, And the resources were allocated by a broadcasting and audiovisual subcommittee, which I actually sat on for nearly 20 years, according to bids that individual departments, individual course teams submitted. You can see here some of the programs allocated to different courses in 1975, including A305, the one I've grayed. We had 24 television programs, which were transmitted on BBC Two twice a week. Anybody could see them. And we had 32 radio programs, which were also transmitted twice a week. Anybody could listen to them. And you'll see, I mean, the foundation courses had the best allocation. Foundation courses in the arts faculty had between 6,000 and 9,000 students. The official view in the OU was that broadcasting material was ephemeral and therefore could not be considered essential. We, that is A305 course team, pioneered the use of broadcast notes, preparing students to watch or listen and providing notes of key information, as well as exercises for revision. This is an example of the exercises where you have a series of questions and then usually some discussion afterwards. Whatever students did with these, surveys show that they appreciated the broadcast notes and was especially used in preparing their tutor-marked assignments and the examination. We also, those of us who examined the end-of-year examinations and looked at the TMAs realized that long before the widespread ownership of video recorders, students typically selected topics vividly described in the media, in TV or radio programs, even 6 months later. So it's not true, and my course is actually one of the ones that actually helped to change the university's views on this. It's not true that the media are ephemeral. If they're done well and if you're providing good preliminary and backup material, they will leave their mark and actually be a very important part of teaching. We later had a messy divorce from the BBC, and our role, unfortunately, now is to subsidize programs they want to make with little contribution from us for the general audience. The university believes that just having a small credit at the end of a BBC program is worth about £10 million a year. We no longer teach through the BBC, but we still make audio and moving image programs transmitted in various ways with the usual panoply of social media connections. Before I retired, I made an entirely online short course on heritage studies, and the Open University has been making online courses for some time. The course was quite well appreciated. The only thing the students didn't like about it was that it was online, they couldn't study paper documents, and they were printing out screen grabs so that they could study on the bus and study at home and scribble on things and use their own tried and tested methods. It's great that universities offer teaching material by their experienced and talented staff to a wider audience. The OU does this too with its Open Learn program with 50 million visitors and its iTunes contributions with 78 million hits. But university education does not stop short at teaching. It requires learning. Learning does not take place until students have digested and mastered the material. Learning involves framing questions, discovering, selecting, and organizing information, assembly of this information in the service of a coherent and persuasive argument that includes a discursive element weighing up alternative propositions. In conventional universities, students have libraries and specialist bookshops, sometimes, to consult. The OU promises that you can pass our courses with what we give you. I'll try to demonstrate how this works in A305. For A305, there were, and remember this is a seminar, one semester's worth of teaching full-time. For A305, there were 12 booklets, here they are, of 120 pages each serving a fortnight's work. The CCA in the exhibition put together, this is the first mailing that the students received, including teaching for the first 8 weeks, so the first 4 fortnightly books. But there's also the radiovision booklet, I'll come back to that, documents, images, and the broadcasting supplements, which I've already explained the broadcasting supplements, but I'll come to the others later. Our texts provide the teaching material, and we try to make it discursive with exercises and discussions, and you can see them there, the questions in bold and the discussions in Rome and afterwards. Whatever students do with these is up to them, but we're persuaded that they are valuable, especially for revision and writing TMAs. But the key element of supportive student learning, and by far the most expensive element of Open University courses, is live tuitions. Our tutors are university, or in those days, polytechnic lecturers. Polytechnics have all been made universities, but in those days they were polytechnics, who teach for us part-time, and many of them incorporate the course materials into their own teaching. The introduction laid out, the introduction to the course, the first 2 units, laid out the course aims and discussed various methodological issues. But let's be honest, A305 was not cutting edge in terms of theoretical speculation. I began work on the course from a standing start. I'd been working on 18th century drawings up until that point, in 1972 at the age of 27. But this was before oppositions, before Tafuri's modern architecture, before Frampton's textbook. The starting point was Banham's theory and design in the first machine age, and Banham was a consultant, author for the course, and first examiner, along with Joseph Brickford. The set books which the students had to buy and read were Banham, Pevsner's Pioneers, used primarily as a whipping boy, along with Hitchcock and Johnson's International Style, used for similar reasons. We set Hitchcock's textbook, Architecture 19th and 20th Centuries, primarily for the American material, and Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture as a primary source. And the students had to buy these books. In fact, there was very quickly a lively exchange of second-hand books that students bought from each other. But we had a price limit that we could set. And I think in those days it was £30. The course was written, Joaquim Moreno, who wrote the book, assembled a kind of bookshelf of the state of scholarship, roughly speaking, according to Joachim, but it's roughly right, at that time in 1975. Okay. That's the kind of things that we had on our bookshelves in those days. The course is therefore a period piece, although I doubt that many architecture students today have as thorough an introduction to the history of interwar modernism as A305, but I would say that, wouldn't I? The course was written by myself, Charlotte Benton, and 3 others, but unfortunately not at once. Sandra Milliken, on the left, was replaced by Geoffrey Baker on the bottom. These are all pictures taken from TV programs. That's me on the right on the bottom there. Geoffrey was on a 2-year release from Newcastle University, and Stephen Bailey, the young man on the right there, who joined the OU in the last months of production. We place a lot of weight on primary sources. So this book, Form and Function, which in America was marketed under the name of the course, History of Architecture and Design, was an anthology of texts, 2/3 of which were translated, never previously translated, texts, which we provided students with, and it still survives in discerning quarters. And on the left is a supplement to that, which 120 pages of other texts that we thought were too closely linked to the themes of the course to be of value for the general readership. We also produced a book called Images, which reproduced 3 books. One was the expressionist Ruf zum Bauen. The other was Gropius's International Architecture. Actually, this was Bertolt Lubetkin's copy. And a sort of a collection of images from Mendelssohn's 2 books, America and Russland, Europe and America. And we encourage students to use these primary sources in their essays and to try to use them in their work. The TV programs were of 2 kinds. Films in color, shot on 16mm film, shot on location in the States, Germany, Austria, France, and Britain. There were roughly 12 of these. I was trying to add it up, but I didn't get to the end of it. But it's roughly 12. The other 12 were shot using what were in the jargon called below-the-line assets. That's to say, there was a studio with fully staffed, with cameramen and a gallery and editors and everything, shooting 1-inch Ampex black and white tape, and we had a free day with the studio. So this, which is a program about the Einstein Tower, we made a model in polystyrene, and there were drawings and things like that, but it was all done in the studio with photographs blown up, and sometimes people standing in front of them and talking and so forth. And this had a zero budget. So that's how we could finish the programs. Most of the TV programs were made by faculty, and you can stream all of them from the CCA site. I hope Mika's going to keep them going for a while. But I have to say that the copies, it's kind of third generation copies, so I'm going to show you a little bit of one of them in a moment, 2 minutes. Of the 32 radio programs, 16 were radio vision. That is, they were accompanied by illustrations printed on 6 pages of a booklet, and speakers on the radio, on public radio, referred to these illustrations by numbers. Okay, illustration 1, illustration 2. This, for example, is a radio vision program I did on Gaudi. So you had first page, second spread, third spread, and final page. These are the illustrations for that radio program. They're very useful because they're like TV programs, in the sense they focused on a particular thing and allowed us to cover things in a graphic way, which we couldn't do in the texts. Many of these programs were made. We used consultants on a lot of them. For example, Francine Haber did the Hector Guimard one. And of the remaining 16 radio programs, radio only, about half of them were from primary source participants, people who had played a role in the 30s. Hitchcock, Pesner, Julius Posner, Amias Connell, Basil Ward, and Bertel Lubetkin, English architects of the 30s, Summerson, who described the founding of the Mars Group, and so forth. We tried to integrate different elements in the course in discussion with William Curtis, here present, who wrote the units on Le Corbusier and on English architecture, and there's the cover of the units. The back cover of the units was actually a teaching aid for a radiovision program that I did on the preliminary drawings for the Villa Savoie. So that's the first project for the Villa Savoie in October 1928, and that's the house more or less as built. And this was a sheet. Here it is. You can see it. Which has a set of drawings from 3 of the selected projects which I discussed. Mirko, can I trust this? I'm going to want it happening. Okay. And I did because William had gone. I think you were here in Harvard. That's right. So I did the TV program on the Villa Savoie, which won a prize, incidentally, at an architecture conference. So I'm just going to play you. How do we do it? Do I just press? Right. This I promise you is only 2 minutes out of the Villa Savoie TV program.
In the waste space was apportioned in ocean liners. The tiny cabin with its built-in cupboards, air conditioning, and washing facilities saves space which is used for large dining rooms, ballrooms, and endless promenade decks. Structural freedom and the resulting planning freedom meant freedom to create grand spatial effects, and this was the phrase promenade architecturale which Le Corbusier used to describe the way we should respond to great architecture. He wanted to create a controlled succession of vistas and spatial experiences for us to discover as we move through his architecture. This promenade architecturale begins, in the case of the Villa Savoie, as you are first driven up in your motor car. This is the most formal facade, with a crisp, apparently solid surface which belies the recessed pilotti which support it. The car runs right in under the first floor slab, inside the outer row of the pilotti. Then the ground floor wall dissolves into the curving wall of glass, which the car follows round.
I wanted to show you this because these things are period pieces. You have to have your tongue in the cheek a little bit.
As well as the spiral staircase, there's the ramp, which is the ceremonial route to the first floor. The ramp continues the fluid movement without a break, upwards through the house. Light comes in from windows on the left, which also give glimpses of the terrace. This is the centre of the first floor. The diagonal ramp almost touches the vertical staircase, which continues upwards to the roof. From here, we have access to the main living rooms of the house. From the terrace, the ramp continues its flow upwards in the open air. As we reach the flat roof, the enclosing walls fall away, except for the curving concrete screen of the solarium.
Okay, so that's just to show you...
Architecture is the masterly,
It's going to finish
correct,
there.
and magnificent play of masses brought together in light.
That's it. Thank you. Right. That program was done in 3 days. A BBC day begins and ends in Ealing. So it was a day that started at 6 in the morning in Ealing, London, drive down to the coast, catch the ferry, arrive tired and annoyed at 1:30 at Poissy, filming in the afternoon, filming one whole day and leaving at lunchtime on the 3rd day. That was the filming conditions. We had a shot ratio of 1.2. That's to say we used virtually all the shots. There's even one shot with a fly walking across it that we used. Okay. We also had summer schools. So A305 had a summer school at Sussex University. This is Basil Spence's Sussex University, where students came in for a week and studied directly with tutors that we hired and with us. And that was very important for us because that's when we actually met the students, and also for them a fantastic experience to have intensive, characteristic undergraduate teaching. Just as music students need to learn to read music, architecture historians must learn to read plans. To this end, I wrote a guide to reading plans in the introductory unit, and we redrew all the plans published in the course to the same standard. Students were given a plan reading guide on the left, and on the back some notes which they could use when confronting any new building. And this was a separate card that we thought they could use as a kind of page mark in the course. We also had there's something's gone wrong there. I'm sorry about that. Behind there is the list of all the course contents. It's published in the presentation of the course at the Biennale, so it's all in Italian. We also had a project for 8 weeks. The students had no direct teaching material, and they had to discover a building, obviously in England, in Britain, explore it, describe it with plans, with drawings, with photographs, tell its history using primary sources, and then relate it to the history of the course. And this produced a series of projects, about 2,000 projects in the 8 years the course ran, many of which are now in the RIBA collection, are an important collection of studies done by undergraduates, some of them good, some of them not so good, of buildings in Britain, many of which have been substantially altered since, and they've been used by many people. For that, we wrote a project guide, and we did a certain amount of teaching directly to help them prepare for their project. For example, this is the other side, Mika, this is your cue again. This is the other side of the sheet, which is here, which is, I can put this one as well, a series of photographs of 66 Frognall. 66 Frognall is a house by Conal Warden Lucas in Hampstead, and I did one radio program which consisted simply of walking through the house and asking questions, and no answers, and they're just taking these pictures, which I took. The house was empty, and we had the run of the place. And we did that. The second program, we gave them material, the original plans, articles about the house, material about the case. There was a legal case about the house. And we interviewed both the architect, Colin Lucas, and the client. And so we provided the answers to the questions we posed at the beginning. So this is a case study, if you like, of how to do a project. So finally, this is the end. This is the ruins of Alexandra Palace, which is where we had our studio at the time, which is where we did the film for Mika's exhibition. What do I think about working with media people, TV professionals? Working with professional camera crews is not easy. Neither the cameraman nor the editors like architecture. The cameraman likes some human activity to follow, and so do editors. It's much easier to create a sequence when you can follow somebody. But we were absolutely against the typical architourism format, where you follow some personage around, you see mostly their back, while they gesticulate and point to things you can't see properly. It was almost impossible to get the camera moving also in tracking shots. That's one of the reasons I showed the Villa Savoye element. It's very, very rare. Cameramen like to put up the camera in those days. This is all technology of a long time ago. There was a film about the Berlin Siedlungen where we had some wonderful tracking shots, but that's because it rained and the crew were very happy to film from inside a car. But normally it's extremely difficult to get them to produce the Arab lesson of architecture, as Le Corbusier called it, of moving through a building. You have to struggle to get cameramen to get the ground in. A cameraman like to get really close and point the camera up, and you don't get any sense of feeling. So the great challenge for me for film, or moving image of any kind, is to recreate the suspense and sense of discovery of a first visit to a building, which is why I like to begin by asking only questions. I did a film about the Maison La Roche by Le Corbusier, where again, the first 10 minutes of the film, nearly half the film, is just moving through the building, asking questions. And then I offer 3 answers to those questions afterwards. So what are the benefits of teaching architectural history with a moving image? Firstly, context, seeing what is left out of the few pictures you are normally allowed in a text or a presentation. Secondly, a sense of scale. Cameramen usually avoid the wide-angle lenses used by photographers, but by moving the camera, by montage, you can get a better, more natural view in some ways of the space, but you need real talent to do it. The cameramen typically are using a much more narrow focal length lens than architectural photographers who get everything in with wide lens. And montage. Montage is the most effective way of creating a visual argument. And a good film about architecture has the argument embedded in the images. It doesn't rely on the text to produce the argument. And finally, process. I did a film about tubular steel furniture where we saw tubular steel chairs being made, and you can see what nonsense it is to imagine that this was an industrial process. It's a completely handcrafted process, and you can see the hundreds of hours that went into finishing these things. That's it. Thank you.
So let me just tell you where we're going, because there are some time constraints. So Lisa and I will try to present this very quickly. Then John May will present, but John has to leave at 1 for another meeting. Sorry, John. But then we, the rest of us, will try to go to the table then and have a panel discussion, and we'll try to bring in the audience very quickly. So let Lisa and I begin. So Lisa and I did the first online course for the Graduate School of Design. And just quickly, it started with very modest ambitions. We accept students who into the MArch 1 program who actually sometimes have very, very good design skills and even technical, sort of structural, constructional skills, but who haven't had enough history. And so this was actually first proposed to be a kind of remedial course for our own students to be taken in the summer. Because we're at Harvard and because there's this institution called Harvard X, they demanded to, at some point, sort of take over control of the course because they wanted to control all the online material of the university. They liked the course so much as it went along, it wasn't even finished, but as it went along, that they pushed us to make it into a so-called MOOC. Remind me what a MOOC is. Massive open online course. Tim, it's amazing to see this. admittedly not knowing of Open University, of course, but not knowing well your project, how much we repeated. There are many, many things. Sort of everything is the same, but everything is different. For example, 7,000 students at Open University, which was a huge number, I suspect, in the 70s. We have hundreds of thousands of students now, and it increases every day. The other thing that I want to talk about a little bit is transmitted using moving images, using the combination of broadcast material and supplementary hard material that's mailed out. We did the same thing, except our course, of course, you can watch it at any time, anywhere, and in pieces. And we actually, maybe Lisa will talk a little bit about we can actually see who rewinds and where. Right? The other thing I want to come back to Mirko's beginning is in the difference in the history course, and now we call it theory in history. The course, we called it the Architectural Imagination, was not a history course. It was a course that tried to convey the tools, the procedures, the techniques one needs to read architecture. We have a reading plan exercise, exactly the same, but we really were trying to let students read architecture, learn to see architecture, learn to understand architecture by reading it. And it's very much a theory and history course. One of the big problems we had, because we were working in a way under Harvard X, Tim, that I think you avoided, there was a constant push to, we called it dumb it down. And we had to push back, and we think, and maybe Lisa can talk about this too, that we think part of its success is that we didn't dumb it down. For example, we do start with 2 presentations, admittedly difficult, on Kant's theory of the imagination, which is where we get the title, and then Hegel's critique, and in a section called Form versus History. Lisa, can I turn this over to you, and then we're just going to ad-lib a bit.
Yeah. Well, I want to first of all say thank you so much for presenting, and I think part of why that was such a good frame for talking about this is that I see your course in the Open University as both a precedent and a model for what we were trying to do. I think especially because we're really thinking about this as its own medium, and I think that's what your course was doing. It's taking advantage of the mediums, not just of architecture as its medium of communication, but the way that it's presented and represented. And for us, that was really one of the most exciting challenges of producing this online course, and that I think made it different from other types, and maybe this is a conversation that we can have in the panel, but that makes architectural education maybe different from other things that might be taught. I wanted to just really quickly, because I'm gonna be really fast because of John's time. We wanted to talk about the 3 types of things that we were thinking about in terms of their capacities in the media. One was the lectures, actual lectures. It was perhaps the equivalent of your broadcasts. The second was the audience, who we expected to take this course. And the third was the assessments, and maybe the equivalent of how we can tell if students are learning, or how we can help students actually learn instead of talking at them. And for each of these, we were really trying to take advantage of all the sort of mediums at our disposal. For the lectures and medium, I wish we could have done site visits to all of our projects. We were not actually able to, given budget and time constraints, but we did the best that we could with a compilation of different things. So this is the trailer that we had put together, where we actually are showing the types of representations that we're using. So both animations and tropes like this, slide carousels, where we're talking specifically about architectural pedagogy through the trope of the slide.
So there was an effort a little bit to defamiliarize or bear the device, that we are showing you images of buildings, not buildings. So that was a bit of a bearing the device.
Yeah, so we wanted to make it clear that the images of buildings that we were presenting was itself a form of representation. And that was sort of a theme throughout the course as we were developing it, that we were showing an image of the building, not to say that this is what the building is, but that you are now going to see a particular way to read the building as we'll present it. And our hope was that that encouraged students to develop their own readings of buildings. Once they know that this was perhaps our interpretation, maybe knowing that then they could go on and develop their own of other things that they hadn't been shown. We use historic footage. So for example, this is Reagan at Bitburg Cemetery, which provoked a controversy that led to the memorial in Berlin by Eisenman. This was, and then we did use some footage when we were able to. So this is footage of the Berlin Memorial that we had a really talented architectural photographer and videographer shoot the footage for us after we had done the script. So she had the script and was sort of visiting the site, knowing what to represent in a sense. And we also relied heavily on animation, so we weren't actually able to visit. So I'm delighted that you showed those clips because we weren't able to visit. So this is sort of the best that we could do, but I think was quite effective in terms of sort of developing how to read a plan or developing how to read motion when one wasn't able to actually visit the building.
And we often, especially in the case of Corbusier, tried to use sort of not original material, but sort of source material like the Œuvre Complète, just to give them a sense of the texture of the archive in a way.
So that's sort of the types of mediums that we're using, and we're thinking really deliberately about each of those choices as we went through the project.
We had music too.
Well, yeah, mostly this is just Michael talking, so I've muted Michael.
Yeah, but we actually, for the Pompidou Center, we were able to use Rolling Stone Street Fighting Man because it mentions Paris and London in the 60s. So we actually got permission to use that.
One of the challenges that we had when we were developing this course, when it went from the internal course to the massive online course, is that we went from a presumed audience of about 20 students that we knew were familiar with architecture and also were invested in the study of architecture, to a totally open, we have no idea who might be watching and what their backgrounds were. And so for us, this was, I think it's a little bit like, you know, an issue of Log getting sold at the airport bookstore, and how do you make that translation? So we had to make some decisions, and I think Michael briefly mentioned that. We were really adamant that we'd not tone it down, in a sense, that we really wanted them to tackle architectural theory and history in a way that we might expect an advanced graduate student to. For us, this was important not only because we needed the course for our own students and be able to stand by it, but we felt that this was the best way to sort of open it up actually more broadly, is to say, you know, here is what we do as architectural historians and theorists. We think that this is an important way of looking at the world. And so for us, I think this was as much of a political statement, in a sense, to say this shouldn't be relegated to the university. It's difficult, but it should be, and anyone can do it also. So it's both difficult, but also available to anyone.
People took it as a challenge. We have a lot of emails saying thank you for challenging and not dumbing down.
So it's really asking people to think, and for us that was really important. That even when it's getting thrown out into the world, that we maintain that position towards thinking about architecture. Andrew, I don't know if I'm allowed to show this. We have our Harvard X person. So Andrew in the back was our sort of point person at Harvard X. He was amazing. So we had a really good working relationship with him. Now I'm realizing I don't know if I'm allowed to show some of this, but just don't tell. So just to say, what, I can? Okay, thank you. So just some of the demographics. A wide spread of learners really across the globe.
But look at Brazil. This is I don't understand that.
That was because someone famous tweeted about it.
Someone famous,
right? Someone famous twittered about edX the day before our course launch or something. A famous Brazilian twittered about our edX the day before we launched. So. And then finally, one of the biggest challenges that we had was thinking about assessments, how students are going to be judged on their work. So we didn't have the ability to personally interact with each of these students. So with thousands of students, we don't even have the what were they called, the tutors, which would have been amazing, because for us, we really had to think about how to assess students without that. Our solution, and typically these online courses rely on peer assessments, so other students enrolled in the course co-assess each other. We didn't like that idea for a number of reasons. We didn't know who, it's kind of like a crapshoot about who you'll get to assess you, but then also we just wanted to make sure that the kinds of questions that were being asked were as rigorous as if a tutor or someone like us was actually asking them. So we developed questions maybe a little bit like the questions that had been developed for the Open University courses, but then we developed a series of, in a sense, answers to the questions. So we asked the students questions, but then developed a second series of questions that asked the students to question their own responses to the original questions, if that makes sense.
Which opens after they submit.
Right. So, so for example, in this one, their first exercise, they have to draw a plan of their place where they live. And after they submit their drawing, they're asked certain things like, have you shown the windows? How have you been thinking about scale? What special types of annotations have you used? So our goal with this, without the sort of being able to rely on assessments of someone who could answer, maybe more authoritatively, we're sort of giving them a way of reading their own work. That for us was kind of like a working method in figuring out. Okay, and with that, I think I really, John, I'm.
Yeah.
Please.
Maybe we can come back with other examples of assessment. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm sorry to compress the time so much. I'm supposed to lead a faculty meeting in like 3 minutes, so I'll go fast. I was thinking back on this when Michael asked, first, Tim, Mirko, thank you for raising this issue. I think the material that's coming out of the exhibition is really provocative and amazing. So I was thinking back, it was a couple of years, well, it was actually now almost 5 or 6 years ago, and I was thinking it was in this very room, that I tried to outline an argument in which that tied the emergence of a new pedagogical instrument to a new way of thinking and making in architecture. And that new pedagogical instrument was the open jury system, which really is a phenomena of post-war architectural education. I mean, it feels like a very normal and natural fact in our architectural education today, but it's actually not very old. Prior to the open jury evaluation, we had what was called the closed jury evaluation. That was the Beaux-Arts model, in which drawings, and sometimes models, but usually drawings, were collected. They were removed behind closed doors and evaluated by faculty. And in that evaluation process, the project was evaluated on the communicative basis of architectural orthographics, that is to say, what was communicated by the line work itself. So there was no spoken discourse at that time, other than perhaps the faculty speaking to one another in their evaluations. Introduced the open jury system immediately during the post-war era, which also spread quite rapidly, such that by 1960 most schools were operating under that model. And in that outline, in the argument that I outlined that day, I not only talked about how this really, I thought, catalyzed a rearrangement between thinking, speaking, and making among architectural students, but, and this is where the room got really uncomfortable for a minute, if you remember, Michael, I also tried to posit that that had something to do with the emergence of what we call post-war architectural theory, in particular the theory of 1968 and after, which is to say that there was something about a generation that passed through this new pedagogical instrument in which they were the first to be asked to speak alongside their objects and to think about what they were going to say as they presented those objects. That, on my view, that had something to do with this incredibly intense period of productivity that we think of as post-war architectural theory. And I think in its best form, we can say that what maybe began as a kind of attitude towards satisfying or a jury or defending one's project in front of one's faculty, actually, once it was unleashed outside the academy, became a really important way for architects to think about the connection between architectural production and the world around them. So it's in that context that I'll just put a few really simple remarks on the table, and then I'll actually leave the room. Yes, it's the best way to make a provocation. I'll have no idea if any of you agree or disagree. I just want to make some really simple sort of media technical comments about these two. So on the right, of course, we have the Open University A305, and just as a technical media object, it's important to remember that this was an analog television broadcast, which is to say that it was open to certain forms of broadcasting and certain forms of manipulation. That is to say, if there was a high degree of noise in the signal, the signal could be modified, color variations could be modified, but ultimately analog media are continuous signals. And so the level of intervention that a technician has into that is relatively limited when compared to the image on the left. The image on the left is obviously from Michael and Lisa's course, which is a digital signal, which means it's discretized, and that means that it is composed not only of a series of digital images that are proceeding at a pace so rapid that we see it as video, but that the images themselves are comprised of discrete electrical signals that are moving at a speed and at a rate that's far below our perception, but that can be easily manipulated with a computational interface. So all of that is to say that probably as part of this discussion, what we ought to think about is if we are moving into an age of quote-unquote online learning, which we probably already have to some extent and will continue to, that we should think about this in the broader scope of what it means for pedagogical instruments to be related to not just ideas, but to sort of entire systems of thought, entire modes of consciousness. Because as I said earlier, I think in its best form, the open jury stimulated a way of thinking about architecture and a way of thinking about architecture's connection to the world, which is so well anthologized in Michael's work and many other people's work. Rather than see MOOCs as necessarily destructive instruments, we might begin to see them as possibly productive. And how would we see them that way? And I think two questions have to go on the table. One would have to be a recognition that the two images I showed earlier belong to two completely different regimes of management. And the MOOCs now belong to a level of statistical management which was completely unforeseen. So Tim, when you were giving some stats about, or maybe it was Mirko was giving stats about the number of people and their demographics and their income group, those statistics are so crude compared to what we're able to collect today. And not only that, but our ability to manipulate the data that is coming out of MOOCs is also crucial to understand. This is, by the way, a Python programming a chat room. And obviously chat rooms are going to be and are already incredibly important instruments in the evaluation of online learning. And so the second piece of that would be to start to ask, what would it mean to have something like statistical literacy among a population of students who are going to be increasingly immersed in these kinds of instruments? Because it's only by asking that pedagogically, I think, that we can stimulate certain kinds of critical thinking within interfaces like this, and maybe even forms of like statistical disobedience in a certain way, because I think there was something slightly disobedient about architectural theory as it emerged out of the open jury system as a sort of system of rhetoric and convincing and argumentation and debate, which I think MOOCs have the possibility to catalyze that, and I have, that's a massive project that would take much longer than this short talk to sort of, elaborate. But at any rate, I'll literally leave you with that. Yeah, thanks.
My intention is to open it to the floor very, very quickly. But first, maybe if we could just, as panelists, and everything was moving so fast I didn't have time to prepare my questions. But I do think the kind of implied genealogy from Open University to MOOCs is an interesting one that so much hasn't changed. I mean, a lot of things have not changed. And even though John is insisting on two different regimes of knowledge, which I understand, and I think we should try to play that out. But one of the things that I'd like to maybe start with the question to Tim, but also Mirko, your experience from having now, you've gone through about 3 schools with this, right? Also from that, Lisa and I found that thinking about teaching architecture raised issues that technology and the moving image certainly helped us address. That, and Andrew, you can jump in at any time too from Harvard X, that other disciplines didn't seem to have even thought about. That a lot of the disciplines, imagine a MOOC on English poetry or a MOOC on Greek classical philosophy. The moving image isn't the thing that immediately suggests itself. And Lisa and I found that we were, I think this is true, Andrew, that we were opening some doors that Harvard X had not opened yet, but because of this.
We just think we're special?
Well,
That's
is
maybe
that
for Andrew, a question for
It's
Andrew.
definitely true, and it's also true for the accessibility concerns that we would have. Like, how do you apply alt tag text to some of these images? How do you begin to provide descriptive accommodations for these things? So yes, it's definitely true for this course.
But Tim, talk about some of the issues that came up, some of the decisions of what to show, how to use the moving image, and when there are, in both cases actually, despite the fact that we're at Harvard, there were limited resources for us.
Yeah.
We couldn't afford to travel to the sites, but so.
Yes, just a little thing about classics, incidentally. You're talking about classics. We had a very brilliant classics department, which became the biggest supplier of classic education, teaching intermediate Greek and Latin at a time when schools of classics and archaeology and everything were withdrawing the requirement to have Latin and Greek. And so we were providing 80% of all intermediate study of Latin and Greek in Britain for historians, for classical studies. Okay, the other thing is that we had a very brilliant lecturer in classical studies who worked on reception. So she actually did use film. She did programs on, I've forgotten what it was before Spartacus, but that sort of thing. So she worked with media sources to uncover the way the tradition of classics has gone down the years. So it's possible, it can be done. Okay. Basically, it's incredibly grungy and empirical how we handled resources. We bid fraudulently for resources by saying that because the people we had to bid to believed the buildings didn't move. So we had to say that we were going to do it entirely about process. So we cooked up all sorts of program ideas which are to do with process. In the end, what we did was we decided that our films were going to be case studies, and this was entirely practical. If you have a 3-day shooting window, you have to stick around. You can't do big comparative programs which show lots of things. Those went onto the radio vision programs. So basically our TV, the film, 16mm color film shoots abroad and in Britain were typically case studies of one building, intense studies of one building, all the time trying to teach students how to approach a building. And it was much simpler than what you're doing. It was basically going in the front door or going in through a window and exploring the building with the implanting of questions and context, of course. And as we did with the Villa Savoirs, I showed there. So it's extremely practical and difficult. In terms of you mentioned, I was very interested in this question of dumbing down. Mm-hmm. In 40 years of working for the Open University, I made about 40 programs on different subjects, mostly the Renaissance. Every single time we would have an argument in the cutting room in which the editor would say, you're doing this for an audience of 50,000 people, perhaps, if we're lucky, 1 million people if we get a good transmission slot. And I would say, we're doing this for our students, and this course will have to be assessed by the course team and by the external examiner. And that pressure happened in every single program we did. Mm-hmm. And it occurred at the basic level of terminology. For example, articulation. Mm-hmm. I was never allowed to use the word articulation. People were constantly telling me to use the word decoration instead of articulation. You know, it makes your fibers tremble.
For a leftist modernist.
For a born in the womb modernist, that's hard, that's tough, and so forth. So it wasn't easy. It's a public-private, if you like, interface, right in the middle of the workplace, which is very difficult to manage.
Yeah. So one of the things, Lisa, help me play this out, and you won't agree. I was actually thinking I knew what John roughly would provoke, and I was thinking if I could make an analogy that Open University, in pre-digital, of course, in the land of still analog tape, and you must have thought constantly about the comparison to TV programming. And remember, TV programming in the 70s is, I guess, half an hour or an hour at best for a single show. And think about the way you would think about organizing a story, and maybe even by analogy, organizing a course or a lecture at a time of TV where there was an hour or at maximum 2 hours. And ours was at the time of the limited series, so-called, or the mini-series, which became, with Game of Thrones, with Breaking Bad, it became this idea of 12 hours of time to make very, multiple plot arcs with sometimes divergent themes. But the point is, even a limited series has to come to a conclusion. And one of the things that I found in our course was that we were constantly aware that the layers of complex themes that we had to lay out, because it did have a historical component, but we were also talking about issues of representation, issues of technology, issues of urban architecture and the urban. So there were these multiple arcs, but we were always making an argument. I think our course has a thesis behind it, and it has something to do with architecture and its engagement with society and culture through technology, through all the architectural things, but it does have an argument.
But that's why I feel like it's more akin to the open. So that's where, I think that the digital, as John was arguing, has less to do with the broadcasts or what our equivalent of the broadcasts were, because I think we're old-timey in the sense that we wanted, and part of the thing is that edX was constantly wanting us to make them shorter.
That's true.
And so to me, if we had made 2-minute clips on Hegel, that would have been sort of the digital moment. Instead, we argued for something that looked more like a historical argument. So for me, I actually see much more similarities, I think, than John might, even to the extent that we were also dealing with limited, we're shooting video, but we also had a day to shoot. So a lot of our decisions were similarly based on those kinds of nuts and bolts constraints of, what you can buy on eBay and then film as your artifact, and which, yeah.
Could I make another point? One of the difficulties was resistance within the faculty. One of the things that I was very keen to try to do in the course of my career at the Open University was to change the paradigm for teaching. Instead of making images, illustrations of an argument, try to provide a situation where you begin with the images. So, for example, there's a course that we produced in 3 different versions over 40 years on the Enlightenment. And that course had a very good, I think, principle that each block, interdisciplinary, so it's philosophy, history, literature, art history, and so on, each one had a set book. And you started with a set text. It might be The Marriage of Figaro or Don Giovanni or something, or it might be, whatever, a book. And you started by reading that book or listening to the work, and after that you arrive at the teaching. I wanted to do this with architectural history. So, yes, my mic's not working, but I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me better now? Okay. So I did a piece on Soane, and I did a CD-ROM, which was a virtual reality visit to the Soane Museum. 42 panoramas. You go in through the front door, you go into each space, you go from one place to the other by clicking on the space. There were 600 hotspots in a database with content on them, so that you could click on individual things. And what I wanted to do was to say, first thing, explore the house. Then we start giving a little bit of information, and then we'll have exercises that say, not just comment on this passage of text and how we've illustrated it with various different things, whether it's film or whatever, but rather do an exercise. Find examples of Gothic objects in the Soane Museum and explain how they're positioned in the house and how that reflects Soane's attitude to, for example, antiquity and history. So I did this. The faculty wouldn't accept it because it was considered too difficult for the students, it's too visual and so forth. So, I mean, we did the CD-ROM, the students were sent it, but I had to do the teaching in a traditional way with biography and ideas and so forth and so forth, so forth about how Soane fitted into the history of the turn of the century and so forth. And, if you can believe it, we made a video, 20-minute video, of me standing in front of the screen while I took the students through the house on my CD-ROM.
Oh. Yeah.
Wait, may I ask a question? Because it seems to me one of the advantages of giving that to a student is that, so they'll know, maybe someone that's not familiar with architecture, they'll know because they've been giving this object that it's important, because why else would you? So they're already looking for things to look at, yeah? But is one of the goals then to say you may look at other objects and discover them on your own, or is that one of the reasons to?
The goal was really to make inquiry the central part of the exercise.
So that they could go to other buildings that were not the Soane Museum, for example, and then say, now that I know how to look at buildings, I can maybe look to see.
Well, yes, I mean, my CD-ROM was just about the Soane Museum,
Yeah,
but
right.
the idea is, yes, that
Yeah.
if you've explored one building, you can explore
Right,
another.
yeah.
May I really, sorry. I really like this discussion about the tools, but the tools are never neutral. So one things that I really liked in the discussion was the shift from the idea of the video recording from Open University to the idea of the acknowledgement of images as a codification of something. But I feel that this conversation could be much more interesting in the sense that both of these, in spite of a lot of other components in the two courses, you are always relating the idea of these to the idea of representation of buildings. And in reality, architecture is more than buildings. So the tools that we have now available, could they, one, introduce a different experience of the building? So it's not only visual, but is much richer than that. Second, could this idea, not only buildings, be expanded? I'm not saying that you are dealing with the drawings, but you are mentioning the idea of society, of process, of timing. Couldn't these introduce a different perspective? You can reconstruct the process of a building construction. You could reconstruct the social context. You could, So I see an incredible potential in these tools to question a very traditional assumption that what you are speaking about is, at the end, a fixed or a movable image of a building. That is one of the problems that I have. The second problem is that in spite of you, Tim, saying that the course was not particularly, how can I say, original, that most of the things, the big historiographical changes happen after. You mentioned Tafur, you mentioned all these kind of things. The historiography was part of the debate at the moment. There were some very interesting points coming out from your Open University courses. The Rainer Barnum participation, but I remember also some of the thematic, not related to the building, the thematic section and the programs that you did, just to mention the one on housing, for example. So I wonder, the second question is, couldn't these online programs offer a space for today producing an alternative or new investigations? I'm thinking, even if I think it's problematic, the efforts of MIT with the global history. Yeah. But I'm thinking, why not to take advantage of that, to explore something that perhaps inside the traditional program of the university are more problematic? Why not to use that for, I don't know, an environmental history of architecture? Why not to take advantage of this space that has not yet been occupied for these kind of explorations?
I think, I mean, yeah, yes.
Well,
I think that's the goal, or
yeah.
would be my goal.
Well, I'll just mention very, very quickly, and then Tim, and then we'll turn it to the audience. There were two cases that I think we really, and we just didn't have time to show so many clips as we would like. In the case of Pompidou Center, the case, we were able to get from the Rogers office the entire files, digital files of the Pompidou Center, and we did mock up. It was a massive amount of work. I think it's already old enough that now it would be easier, but it was a massive amount of work that we mocked up. First the structure, then the infill walls, and then the weaving of the HVAC and escalators. We mocked that up, and that was a case where it was very, very vivid. The concept of that building could be animated. And similarly in Berlin, Eisman's project, the ground is a kind of undulating, but then the pylons are also, there's an implied undulating ceiling of the pylons. We animated that. So I think what the audience saw was, to conceptualize a building project like that is a very vivid and very complex thing that is already in motion in a way.
But both of those two programs also, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but I think at least half of it was not images of buildings at all, but rather was images of the historical and social context.
May 68,
so we were definitely trying to use other things that weren't just building representations, but sort of the zeitgeist or what the cultural moment was happening. So that's why we relied a lot on historic footage and that kind of thing.
I want to turn to the audience. I want to ask William to say something about the Open University. But before Melanie, do you mind if I know I'm putting you on the spot and I didn't prepare you, but Melanie Park was the kind of tutor that we used for our summer class. And I wonder if you could just say very briefly the difference between Harvard X now is moving towards something they're calling a high touch course. And this would be a course, and Andrew can correct me if I'm wrong, that would include, say, doctoral students as tutors that would interact one-on-one, or if not one-on-one, would interact live with the students at certain periods. And Melanie had that experience with our own students that we teach in the summer. Melanie, if you could just say something about how that changes and how the assignments changed a little bit.
Well, I think the biggest sort of challenge for me, so there were two models that I operated on. On the first year, we got the students to literally come online at the same time, wherever they were situated in the world, which itself was a challenge, because we had people in Asia versus Europe, and it was a nightmare. And I think I had about 18 students. And I literally had all 18 up on the same screen. And it was chaotic, but I think this model worked far better than the model we actually did this year, which is let's all submit our questions and post it to a platform. And I don't know what it was, but it's still that engagement of like having to like confront the screen yourself and be on it. And I'm there actually asking you online, sort of as a one-to-one interaction. Seems much better than can you post your questions on a board. There's sort of a less accountability factor in the latter example. And I think another kind of interesting thing is that we have one exercise where the students are asked to make a model of Aldo Rossi's Cuneo project. And this is where it gets interesting because, again, the accountability factor is we ask them to transport it while moving house from London, China, to by the time they get to the GSD, we ask them to bring this, 25 centimeter model. And, again, the transportation is again a problem, but then they all bring it, and then we discuss sort of, how did you make it? What were the difficulties, the material conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think ultimately the online has to be supplemented by some kind of human engagement. And I think that's sort of the key. If we had left it closed where they don't have to sort of, they just say, I've done the exercise, so I've met my prerequisites, I have no architectural history background, so now, I'm done. There is zero accountability. And in a way that, we are expecting them to be sort of adults and, I've done the course, but it's much better to sort of have that feedback. And I think that's sort of, that's an important reminder that the human factor can't be lost in this. And I think there are ways to integrate the tutor model, even more so into the model that we have. And I think Andrew and I can perhaps work on that for next year. Yeah.
William Curtis, do you want, okay, we have.
Just a quick comment. I think, sorry, hi. I think one of the limitations of like distance education is the role that plays the instructor or, like the people who make the course. But there's like, now we have artificial intelligence, like taking over automatized relationships with humans in chat rooms. For example, in, customer service, you can't even notice you're talking to a machine. So I'm thinking that maybe one of the shifts that could happen like in the near future regarding education could be the implementation of artificial intelligence to keep that that role of and not having 18 people on the same screen at the same time. I don't know if that's maybe something that has ever crossed the mind of people.
I heard the opposite. I heard that the personalities and the individuality of the people on the screen, and I would argue of the presenters of the material, the personality, the fact that we use multiple lecturers. Actually, we heard a lot of stories about the way they, Antoine was more serious and Erica was very clear, and and those kind of personalities.
Not unexpected.
Yeah, not unexpected. Yeah, and to me, and I'm not disagreeing that there would certainly be a way to find artificial intelligence, but I think the part of the moving image and part of the broadcast, even on radio, where the voices matter, the individuality of the voice.
Can I respond to that? I think that two things. First of all, we organize things in such a way that all the authors or representatives of all the books which were set books were also radio programs. The students heard the authors of the books they were reading talk. And we had a lot of feedback that they really appreciated that, as well as lots of other people. I was going to say something else. I've forgotten words. I'll come back. I was going to say something else.
William, yeah.
Yes, well, first of all, I think it's wonderful that you've gone back to A305, which was a fabulous operation and experiment. And I remember the very early discussions with Tim and Charlotte Benton about what it could do and so forth. And then I was invited in to do 2 of those units, which were just going around, one on Le Corbusier and one on the English architecture of the 30s, which were both written here, 24 Prescott Street and on the top of Carpenter. And if I may say, there was a strong theoretical ingredient in my approach, because I was already deeply involved in problems of symbolic form, issues of meaning, relation. I talk about the problem of political content in the 30s, for example, and in the case of Villa Savoye, the complexity of symbolic meaning, all the way from the overt to the hermetic. I had just come hot off having written the book on Carpenter Center, which goes through drawings into the problem of intentions, and in that period was setting the basis for what eventually I taught at Carpenter Center for 6 years, which were introductory courses, learning to see, which were called Towards an Integrated Theory of Form, Towards an Integrated Theory of Design, From Idea to Form, the problem of the symbol. Theory was very present, but not the versions that you're talking about. However, I was always insisting on the importance of visual thinking, that en fin de compte, finally, we are talking about another kind of knowledge, which is not just textual, it's not just mathematical. It involves space, it involves all these things. So how did you train people? Now, the image, the question is, we're using the word moving image, but a still image in a montage can be an extremely powerful instrument. The parallel, and there's the quality of the image. A great photograph is an idea. A snapshot is just a snapshot. There's a difference. And a photograph that is like a good text, it penetrates. Similarly, speaking of the personality, the text is a personality. I wrote mine as knowing that someone in Sunderland in the north of England, after work, is opening up, what's this Villa Savoye? It's an accompanying voice. It was written in a discursive manner, trying to make complex issues understandable and simple. So to me, I'm also a photographer, it turns out. And when Mirko brought up the issue of other senses, I had an exhibition in the Alhambra 3 years ago, which was called Abstraction et Luz, Abstraction and Light, which was mainly my paintings, sketches, drawings, but also photographs. And there was a series of images, which is called Atmosferas de la Alhambra, with snippets of sound, water, swallows, the voices of tourists, wow, wow, wow. And it was alucinante. I mean, to be in the chapel and have the real thing over there. So we're talking about analogs, actually. When you do what you do, we're talking about analogs for the complex reality of architecture. And quite clearly, one of the problems with visual and even moving images, whatever you like, still moving, it depends on the quality of construction of a film, finally. They cut out so much of what makes architectural experience, which, as we all know, endlessly, is all of the senses, its sound, its movement, and so on. So it's an approximation which should be encouraging people to go and see for themselves. And that was what the Open University did. That's what I think you're doing. It's what I did at Carpenter Center for 6 years. Every student in the midterm had to go out and choose a building, the what, the why, the how, inside out, draw it, photograph it, understand it, investigate it, and so forth. So I think this is all a branch of visual education in a larger sense. I'm so glad you've picked up the torch over here, because sadly the E of VES has disappeared years ago in Carpenter, but that's what we did. Edward, myself, and others. Yeah. And anyway, just some thoughts.
Yeah, good. I think
if I may say, the interrelation between the theoretical mode of reflection, the historical, and the visual was absolutely part of the reflection, and self-consciously so.
Yep.
Way back then.
Absolutely. Yep. Do we have time for one more page, or? Yeah. So, Sharon, last comment.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's a comment and also a question, partially because of the kind of the archival exhibition out there that was moving image, and partially also because I worked as a documentary filmmaker before. And the question is, the moving image, I don't think in the architecture school, I don't think people consciously think about. It's a very different medium, how you communicate, how you grab attention. And filmmakers have been studying this since the beginning of cinema as the medium, since the beginning of the 19th century. But I think there's always this, the fact that nobody who is a director or screenwriter, I don't know, you guys didn't mention any of those people, are on board when you're trying to communicate something through the moving image, which is its own medium, just as architects work with plans and sections. Is there logic behind it, or do you think filmmakers today, as Tim, I think you mentioned, they are still kind of focused on the traditional Hollywood narrative arc, kind of how people develop a character in a narrative? I don't know if it's a coherent question yet, but I think I wanted to know what you think on that.
Yes, I mean, I think it's, in many ways, it's more difficult to make a film, a documentary film, discursive, that is to stimulate the student to think and not just listen, than in a text. And this is one of the reasons I was constantly having to fight the people I worked with, cleverer people than me in terms of filmmaking and so forth, to do this, to slow down the presentation and to show different points of view and ask questions. I mean, I was ridiculed in the English architectural press because there was a little to camera of me in the Villa Savoie, and I asked, what is this house like to live in? But that's the right question to ask. You can't do it in an academic article, really. But it's the right question to ask.
Yeah, it shouldn't be it shouldn't be reading an academic essay and showing pictures. Sharon, I completely agree. I think it's a good point. Lisa, before she came to our PhD program, made documentary film.
I totally agree with you.
With GBH, so you're hired for our next project. You can work with Lisa. But I want to just say one thing about slowing down. The other thing I think Lisa brought to it, and it's something that I wasn't aware of from her experience, how to slow it down, but how to interrupt it. Lisa introduced a lot of things that, in a way, at first I thought was kind of decorative, in the sense that when we were talking about the situationist, Lisa, you saw a glimpse of it, reenacted the how's it called, the
Tahrir map.
Yeah, the Tahrir, the tearing apart the Tahrir map of Paris and putting it back together. She reenacted that as I talked about situationism and the drift, the urban drift. So how to interrupt the text with the visual, I think, is absolutely crucial.
And there's also, I mean, just the fact that you have to be able to understand the tropes that people know from cinema and television, and that, which is hard to describe unless, actually I can't even talk about it. It just, unless you're working in it, you can't really talk about it, but it's really important to be able to do, and that's not at all the same thing as writing an essay, or even delivering a lecture in the lecture hall. So our first version of it, where Michael would be like, here's our 20 slides, that's what we'll illustrate it.
That's
and I
what
was
we'll
like,
show.
well, you can't have an hour-long moving image program with 20 images. Like, people will turn it off within 30 seconds. So, like, we had a lot of conversations about that, sort of how to make it both accountable to what we needed it to do pedagogically, because again, that was sort of the primary aim, but then also recognizing that we're working in a medium that had familiarity in a broader sense, that not just people studying film, but people watching movies and television all the time, and that we had to take that into account.
William, you get the last word.
I was, just last week in Rome in the Maxi, there's a major exhibition about Bruno Zevi, and they asked me to come and reflect upon Zevi and what he'd meant to me and not meant to me and so forth and so on. And as you know, he wrote that book, Saper vedere architettura, which was, how to look at architecture, way back in 1949 or whatever it was. And the exhibition, I know you're having a seminar or something about it here, but he was, a totally engaged and engaging personality. And one of the really remarkable films with him is In Santivo de Sapientia, with him very much the central, glamorous personality, but revealing why it is an architecture of dynamic space, even taking rods and laying them down to show you the geometry going to infinity. And then it's very well filmed because let's say his voice and the eye of the camera working well together. You flash over to the Pantheon and the way it's constructed. You come back to the construction of Santivo, and of course he's making his point that it's an anti-classical building according to him. But it is absolutely masterly. I don't know the date of that thing. I'm sure it'll come up in your things. But he was someone involved in broadcasting in Italy, trying to teach people to see There's a wonderful one about the Campidoglio where he says, if you put the blocks parallel, it's boring. If you do it this way, it's too open. If you do it this way, basta. And yeah. So, it's been around for some time. Briefly, another observation. When I first came to this university, one of the most inspiring things I saw was Charles Eames giving the so-called Charles Eliot Norton lectures. They were anti-lectures. There was never a comma or a full stop. And it was using triple screen analogies. And it was mind-blowing how you can, through very beautiful photographs, reveal things. And, of course, create an idea. Isn't it Eisenstein who says in film form, two elements, shot elements, put together, create an idea?
Yeah, it's great. Thanks to our guests. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Mirko. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you.